Taylor and Francis. Thank you to Tom Murden and John Manley at Taylor and Francis. I'm Tom Sanchez, editor of Housing Policy Debate and professor of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech. I'd like to thank Mato Gebrselassie, a doctoral student at Virginia Tech, for her assistance in organizing this event. Also like to thank Mackenzie Spriggs for her help with planning and logistics, and Ralph Bueller, the chair of the Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech, for his generosity in support of the symposium. Today, we will hear from the authors of 4 articles and 3 commentaries to appear in a special section of Housing Policy Debate, actually due out any minute. We were expecting that it would be available by now, but I think like other disruptions that we've seen because of the pandemic and other things, the publication process has slowed just a little bit. But I will make sure to get a notice out about the publication of that special section to everyone. Very much like to thank our presenters and their co-authors for their excellent research and insightful comments that will appear in the journal. So I am pleased to welcome Ariel Bierbaum, Geoff Boeing, Adriana Bruno, Shomon Shamsuddin, Robert Goodspeed, Nicholas Marantz, and Tan Yigitcanlar. We will go in that order. There are going to be the four papers. We'll have 15 minutes each. I'll kind of give you a little signal if we're getting close to being out of time, and then 10 minutes each for the commentary, and that should leave us about 15 or 20 minutes of question and answer at the end. If you've got questions along the way, for those in the audience, you can put that in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that, and if there are some of those questions we want to address as we transition from one presentation to the other, we'll go ahead and do that. I'd also like the presenters to acknowledge their co-authors prior to presenting. Just let everybody know who's been involved with your particular publication. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. To the audience, please use the Q&A window throughout the presentations, and then we'll try to address as many of those questions as we can. Okay, well, we will start with Ariel. Great,
thank you, Tom. So I will just take a moment for the technology here. And are you looking at a presentation?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, great. Well, thank you, Tom, and everyone for being here. Thank you for convening us. It's really my pleasure to be here today and to share a brief summary of the work that we did in this paper in the journal on equitable smart cities work in Baltimore. And I am here on behalf of my collaborators and co-authors, Willow Lungamam, Garrett Knapp, Sherry Parks, Gail Sunderman, and Lauren Stam. So our work builds on the foundation of scholarly critique of smart cities that specifically argue that these interventions are often, unfortunately, solutions in search of problems that approach cities in an acontextual, ahistorical, and an aspatial way. In other words, they pay little attention to the unique social and spatial conditions of neighborhoods in general, and particularly those of low-income communities of color. So as a result, rather than meeting the critical needs of residents, the adoption of new technologies has often created or exacerbated the digital divide and disparities in income and wealth and life outcomes across individuals and communities. And so we're taking seriously these critiques. That's how we approached our work in Baltimore, and to try to better understand to what extent smart city technologies can actually increase access to opportunity or enhance social mobility and help mitigate the digital divide. Our motivation is also deeply local and grounded in the Baltimore context. And Baltimore is actually no stranger to sort of smart cities even before we kind of coined or had that term sort of in popular parlance. In the 1990s, Baltimore could be considered an early adopter of many early civic technology and smart city platforms like 311 and CityStat. And then more recently, since the mid-2010s through today, it's had varying success with implementing a range of technologies from drone surveillance that was abandoned after lawsuits from the ACLU to LED lights, and improved broadband access, which have perhaps obviously, but notably has accelerated since the pandemic took hold. Notably in Baltimore, many of these interventions were actually driven by private companies with products to sell to the city, and by city agencies who were responsive, if not proactive, in responding to those private sector interests, but with very little input from Baltimore residents about what their needs are and how these interventions could support those needs. So under a recent mayoral administration, 2 mayors ago, but not that long ago, such as the life of leadership in Baltimore, the city released a strategic plan for smart cities investments, and it called out specific substantive priority areas like public safety and education. But it also had a very strong emphasis on public engagement. And in part, this was to redress the gaps in public input of these prior efforts I just mentioned. And it really also called for internal changes inside of city government to try to improve transparency and accountability. And so this sets the stage for us and our team of researchers. So we are, again, grounded in that critique, grounded by the mayor's office and the leadership in Baltimore, and wanted to focus specifically on this issue of engagement and try to understand how community engagement could actually help improve smart city planning and investment by specifically looking to address the needs and concerns of low-income communities of color and other historically disadvantaged groups and neighborhoods. And so we conducted engaged research with community-based organizations in West Baltimore, working with the Upton Planning Committee, Druid Heights Community CDC, and some other groups in the area. The 2 that I mentioned are longstanding organizations. They've been in the community since the early 1970s, and they've been doing the full complement of community development work, from housing and beautification, youth development, job training, re-entry programs. So they had deep ties to the community. The study area, for those of you not familiar with West Baltimore, is 92% of the residents in our study area are African American. This is a community that has been historically disadvantaged and marginalized. It is underinvested in and over-policed. And it's the western side of, in Baltimore, what is known as the Black Butterfly, which is used to describe the actual spatial segregation of Black and low-income communities in the city. It has low education levels, low home ownership rates, and low incomes. The median in our study area is about 1/3 of the city's median. And as a bit more context, again, for those of you that are not super familiar with Baltimore, but this set of neighborhoods is adjacent to the neighborhood where Freddie Gray, who was killed at the hands of police in 2015 and led to a series of uprisings. This is that community broadly defined. So we worked with these community organizations and local leaders and conducted 10 focus groups and administered a survey to young people, adults, and to seniors, specifically looking to better understand residents' concerns and priorities for their neighborhood, to dig a little bit more deeply about their technology use and access, and then also to brainstorm with them about potential smart city solutions that they had, and also vetting some of the ones that the city was interested in initiating. And so I'm going to share some of the highlights from those findings. So in terms of neighborhood concerns, there was a strong emphasis from our respondents on the underdevelopment of West Baltimore neighborhoods, both in an absolute sense and relative to their counterparts throughout the city and region. So from food and retail to internet and transportation infrastructure, respondents articulated that they did not receive the same access to basic services or amenities as residents of higher income neighborhoods. And these concerns were about a lack of local businesses to patronize, but also jobs and educational and youth opportunities. It also meant a lack of wealth and ownership, both in businesses and housing. And we heard a lot about ownership and the lack thereof, which really for us demonstrated the community's sophisticated understanding of the structural and intergenerational mechanisms of wealth and or poverty transfer. In focus groups, we heard a lot about issues of transportation, particularly recent changes to the bus system that made it even harder and less reliable to access jobs and other opportunities outside the neighborhood. Safety and security, particularly violent crime, along with schools and education, were top issues of concern on our surveys. And that was true across age groups, from youth to seniors and other adults. And notably, as I'll talk about in greater detail, anxiety about neighborhood safety actually drove particular kinds of engagements with technology. So participants, especially adults, expressed concerns about using technology outdoors or in public places because they feared it would make them a target of crime. So they certainly couldn't use laptops out there, but folks also expressed concerns about using phones in public and being a target for theft, which certainly has ripple effects, which I will talk a little bit about when we think about the ideas that the city had in terms of interventions in these communities. Our respondents reported difficulties in accessing basic reliable technologies such as computers. So only 64% of our survey respondents had regular access to a computer. Only 61% had regular access to a computer at home. This compares with about 67% of Baltimore residents who have a desktop or a laptop, according to census data. To make up for this gap, some respondents are using publicly available computers at schools and libraries. However, we heard a lot of details about how these arrangements pose challenges. So pre-pandemic, which is when our study took place, there were limits on time and printing and other functions that actually make them less reliable than home computers. So it wasn't sort of a safe bet for folks to be using these public computers. And now, of course, post-pandemic, as you can imagine, these public services are closed. And so in terms of access at all, we haven't done follow-on work, but I would expect that we would see even more hardship in this space than we had heard about 2 years ago. Most respondents on the surveys and in focus groups reported using their cell phones for everyday activities. So 91% of people did have a cell phone. 68% reported that they accessed the internet using their cell phone. But interestingly and notably, resident cell phone use included tasks that are often considered computer necessary or computer dependent. So we had young people completing complicated homework assignments. We had young people and adults talking about how they were applying for jobs on their phones. And phones were like a literal lifeline for people. One participant talked about her life after the death of her partner and the father of her children, who she was deeply dependent on, and actually talked about how the phone was the only way that she sort of had access to outside communication and to sort of get her life back together after this life tragedy. Internet service was a huge issue. For folks. There was a lack of reliable and affordable internet in the neighborhood. So the cost of internet service was too high, and the requirements to access even the low income Comcast Essentials program were often still prohibitive. Despite the fact that respondents are relying on their phones in the ways I just described, only 72% of respondents had a monthly plan that included talk, text, and data. We did not get detailed information about if they had unlimited data, right? So the data limitations are still an open question. But 18% of our participants were using prepaid plans. And so, that raises questions about how they can complete tasks efficiently and effectively, especially given that the tasks they articulated and told us they are completing are pretty life essential. In light of unreliable and limited internet or mobile data, we heard a lot of creativity of approaches about how people carry out their daily tasks. People sat outside of libraries and schools. There was a robust sort of community mental map of what McDonald's and Starbucks had Wi-Fi service that you could sit inside or outside of. Sometimes they would sit on stoops of neighbors who they knew had Wi-Fi at home. And one participant whose stoop was used as a free Wi-Fi spot noted that she didn't mind sharing with her neighbors, but she eventually had to cut it off because it slowed service for her work, for her 2 kids who were also in school. And youth were particularly savvy, perhaps unsurprisingly, at navigating to find Wi-Fi, although for them, some of these strategies did increase risks to personal data and safety. And so they are creative. Respondents also, I would say, did express some concerns about the smart technologies that they already saw deployed in the city and in their West Baltimore neighborhoods, in particular, some of the public safety technologies like blue light cameras and ShotSpotter, questions about their effectiveness, and also concerns about excessive surveillance and the use of that kind of data by police and city leaders. We also heard some critique of some of the smart city interventions, that they were maybe an unnecessary use of money at best, and at worst, an actual pathway to further cutting neighborhood residents off from good paying jobs in the public sector or other kinds of opportunity, as evidenced by this quote you see here. And, again, as I mentioned earlier, the reflection on technology access, smart city initiatives, jobs, again, we heard again and again a very clear awareness and sophisticated understanding that the ways these technology issues are actually a manifestation of broader systemic issues that would ultimately hold West Baltimore back as technology continues to advance and get deployed, unless that sort of momentum is interrupted, which is hopefully what we were trying to contribute to by asking these questions and providing the feedback to city leaders and others. So when we turn to questions of solutions, conversations included deep discussions of process as much as the tangible outcomes of these interventions. And this is connected to history, right? When we know working in community development and housing, we have to listen to communities, and what they've experienced sort of prior to our interventions affects how they receive our current efforts. And folks talked about the deep mistrust that is a function of the cumulative relationship of not being listened to over the last many decades by the city. And so they had, I think expressed we heard some level of optimism that this could be an opportunity, but that really building trust needed to be sort of at the forefront of any smart city interventions that folks were going to participate in. So we had lively and creative conversations. So different kinds of indoor and outdoor locations for Wi-Fi hotspots. Folks had really interesting ideas about how improved technology could be coupled with or catalyzed other kinds of community development improvements, like parks or reopening recreation centers. They talked about developing mobile applications that, again, community-driven data collection around crime or safety or jobs, a grocery store delivery app that would be local to sort of help fill the gaps of healthy food options. So again, participants really saw the opportunity in the construction and maintenance of smart technology interventions, not only sort of the app world, but also thinking about fiber optics and how that could be used for more sustainable and robust job creation.
About 1 minute, Ariel.
Okay, just wrapping up. So finally, again, I mentioned community ownership at the front end. So this really came through, and it was not only about ownership, but also about public accountability and feedback loops with the city. And so what we feel like our research in Baltimore has demonstrated is that the ways in which engagement in disadvantaged communities really needs to focus on identifying investments that meet community needs and priorities first. That needs to sort of take the lead, and it needs to take into consideration these place-specific conditions, sort of in these 4 ways to combat that sort of critique I started with, right? So that we're no longer ahistorical or aspatial. We're thinking about time and relationships over time, and the diversity that is found in these communities. So I'll leave it at that. Of course, we know, right, there's not a smart city solution for every issue in disadvantaged communities. And when there are smart city interventions, they certainly can't comprehensively address all of the complex social, economic, and other factors that contribute to the conditions in these communities. But we hope that our work provides a provocation and perhaps a little bit of a roadmap for how we can think about smart cities technologies embedded within larger engaged planning and community development processes to help build equity, particularly for disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ariel. Okay, we will move to, excuse me, Geoff Boeing's presentation.
Sure, let me share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Great. All right, thanks everyone. My name is Geoff Boeing. I'm an assistant professor at USC. And my topic today is about housing search in the age of big data. So this paper was co-authored with Max Besbris, Ariel Schachter, and John Cook. And the overall theme of this paper is about the information landscape of online listings. And it's a critique of how techno-utopianism around democratization of data, using technology to mitigate racialized urban interactions is usually misguided. So the context here is that, as we all know, the rental housing market has increasingly moved online over the past couple of decades. Most of the information exchange now happens on websites where people post rental listings and other people search for rental listings. In the past 15 years, Craigslist has become a dominant information exchange where more listings are posted there than they are in other sources of information. According to the 2019 AHS, in urbanized areas, more renters used a website like Craigslist to find their current home than any other source of information about available housing units. This is a really important player now in how we find things online, but we don't know that much about how representative it is of the full market. So on one hand, websites like Craigslist could reduce our housing search costs. They could expand our search radii and our choice sets as we're looking online without having to expend all of that extra effort on the ground or talking to individual people one at a time. But the big question here is, for whom might it offer those benefits? So if there are biases in what is being posted online, it could take a couple of different forms. So on one hand, it could impact the conclusions that we as scholars or policymakers are drawing from looking at rental listings to try to understand affordability or market trends. But more importantly, it could also impact information equity and how housing search costs are increased or decreased for different communities. So to just take a step back for a second here, different communities obviously would prefer different housing search information channels for a variety of reasons. So some people might use Craigslist to find housing information. Other people might rely on the newspaper for familiarity's sake. Others might draw on their social network to talk to friends or family to try to figure out what's available and where. This could be a function of language or age, wealth. So different people may have access to computers and internet connection that's more stable and more reliable than others do. Some might prefer relying on a Chinese or Spanish language Facebook group to find housing information. So both internet usage would differ among these groups, but also the individual channel to get information might differ. So on one hand, the internet promises this sort of information democratization for traditionally information disadvantaged households. But if we have these self-selection biases into different kinds of technologies or channels, we could reproduce or exacerbate the long-standing information inequalities that have always existed with traditional data in a new digital form. And in the end, we could see this modern form of steering, where segregation into different information channels could accelerate residential segregation through filter bubbles and limiting our horizon of available information of what's available, where to look, where to live. So the big motivating question for this research was, do online platforms resolve those kind of traditional problems that have long plagued old-fashioned, non-big, boring data in the housing search? So do we all have access to the same information landscape, or does quantity and quality of information reflect the underlying sociodemographics and historical information inequalities in the housing search? So to answer that, we web scraped millions of listings from Craigslist. And then we joined them to the 12,000 or so tracts in the core cities of the 50 most populous MSAs. And that joining gives us an observed spatial distribution of listings. Once we've done that, we attach tract level ACS data to get demographic and economic information about those places. And then we can assess over and under representation at the tract level. So to do that, we redistribute each city's listings in proportion to the number of vacant units for rent in each tract, and then compare the observed spatial distribution with that proportional redistribution. So it gives us a sense of how many more or fewer rental listings we have relative to the number of vacant units for rent in each place. And we find some pretty striking patterns. So first off, there's really strong spatial compression. That is, rental listings are much more concentrated in reality than a proportional distribution around a city would be. And there's a strong racial and ethnic component as well. So over half of all of the majority white tracts are overrepresented by this measure, but only 19% and 22% of Hispanic or Latino tracts are. And conversely, only 11% of majority white tracts are very underrepresented. So by very underrepresented here, I mean that those tracts have fewer than 25% of the listings that we would expect in the proportional distribution. So it's only 11% of white tracts. We see over a quarter of majority black tracts and over a third of Hispanic or Latino tracts being very underrepresented. Now, if we look between these over and underrepresented tracts, we start to see some clear patterns. So the white proportion of the population is 20 percentage points higher in the overrepresented tracts, and Hispanic and Black proportions of the population are lower. Median incomes, home values, and rents are higher in overrepresented tracts, and those overrepresented tracts tend to be better educated and with more current college enrollment as well. Now, if we control for covariates in a regression model, we find that consistently higher incomes and education levels predict greater representation on Craigslist. But greater Black or Latino proportions of the population predict lower representation, all else equal. And so this is across cities, but it's useful to look within cities with a quick Miami case study where these differences are particularly stark. So in Miami, if we look at over versus underrepresented tracts, we can see that in the overrepresented tracts, the white proportion of the population is 2 standard deviations higher. Proportion with a college degree or higher is 2 standard deviations higher. And one interesting one, the median home value is 2.3 times higher in over compared to underrepresented tracts. So these aren't the same kinds of places that are being over and underrepresented. We see this very clear sort of information segregation into more advantaged communities, at least on Craigslist. And we'll come back to that distinction in a minute. So beyond that idea of the quantity of information online, we also looked at the quality of information. So one way we did that is looking at the specific amount of information in each listing. To do that, we use structural topic modeling to look at differences in kinds of information in different kinds of tracts rental listings. And what we found was that in communities with more Black, Latino, or poorer residents, we find that the rental listings contain less information, so fewer words per listing, and that they also disproportionately focus on tenant disqualifications. So stuff like proof of income or eviction history, rather than talking about unit and amenity descriptions. So with less information in the word count, but also a disproportionate focus on who you're allowed to be and what kind of things you must have to be qualified as a potential tenant. And then conversely, if you look at whiter or lower poverty areas, you find that listings contain more information, more words per listing, and they devote much more text to describing the amenities and the units themselves. Now, beyond just these distinctions, there's a clear racial hierarchy here. So if we compared to low poverty white communities, the listings in low poverty Black or Latino communities consistently contain less information and still that stronger focus on the tenant disqualifications. And in particular, non-poor Black tracts contain fewer words per listing than any other type of tracts besides poor Black and Latino tracts. So even non-poor Black tracts still have this lower volume of information and lower quality of information within it. Now, as a second piece of information quality, we looked at filterable fields. So these filterable fields on websites like Craigslist are really important for quickly being able to filter out the kinds of housing units that you're not interested in looking at because they don't meet the basic criteria of what you need in your dwelling. So searchers who require particular amenities were systematically unable to find that essential information in poorer neighborhoods and neighborhoods with higher shares of Black or Latino residents. So those fields include information like, is an exact address provided? Something about conveying the trust that the landlord has in sharing this listing. The presence or absence of a washer dryer, and information about allowing pets. So all of these fields are important for being able to quickly filter listings based on your needs. But we see those same poverty and racial hierarchies as we saw before with word counts and the kinds of descriptions that are being provided. So here, Craigslist is quickly foreclosing searches in disadvantaged communities for home seekers who are in need of particular amenities. And if they have the means to search in more advantaged communities, they will, because that's where the information is available. And those searchers in turn will fail to learn about disadvantaged places and the knowledge that they rely on for future moves and pass on to their own social networks remains siloed and isolated. So the key takeaway here is that folks who live in whiter, wealthier, better educated, more expensive communities overall have an information surplus available online to guide their housing searches, while folks in other communities face an information deficit, which on one hand perpetuates long-standing patterns in housing search, but also stands to exacerbate and accelerate them because everything is made faster, quicker, and bigger with these kind of technological solutions. Now, Craigslist is just one platform. There are lots of other options out there, like I mentioned at the beginning, but it's also the largest platform and it has the lowest entry costs. It's free, it's ubiquitous, it's very easy to use. So we would expect to see even more information channel segregation typically in other places than this sort of big tent platform. As cities and citizens continue to turn to technology to try to mediate urban processes, we would expect to see more unanticipated consequences, such as these housing information filter bubbles appearing throughout those other interactions. Regulating these kind of inequalities isn't easy. So these information inequalities that we're documenting here are particularly pernicious because they result only in aggregate from lots of individual decisions about where to search, what information to provide, that don't violate current fair housing laws that regulate individuals' words and behavior in this space. So the key implications here are that these platforms can be useful. They do expand your choice sets. They can reduce your search costs. They can expand your search radii, exposing you to more kinds of places. But they don't do that evenly for all communities. These markets are concentrated in certain communities, and that differs presumably from platform to platform. And they're also digitally segregated by race and class because of that kind of concentration. So one big question coming out of this is, what is online listings' role in gentrification and neighborhood discovery? So if these listings are concentrated in whiter, wealthier places, is that a form of digital inequality for disadvantaged neighborhoods? Or does it give them a sort of shielding and a redoubt of illegibility where folks with more money, whiter folks, aren't necessarily able to find these communities online, which protect them from gentrification and displacement further down the line? And then the big question about market segmentation and information channel preferences. So people prefer these information channels for different reasons, but that doesn't mean that there aren't bad outcomes that can result from that in the long run. So regulating it is tough. Part of it might be on the supply side, so requiring landlords to make more information publicly available or having public central registries where we can collect relevant information to make these housing searches more equal across all demographic groups. Some of it might be on the demand side too, where advocates could work with disadvantaged communities to try to aid their housing searches, focus on what unit and amenity information they need rather than geographical familiarity, to try to expose them to new communities they might not already be familiar with in their social network silos.
Geoff, looks like you...
I'm all done, yeah. So if you're interested in this paper, I have a QR code. If you have your phone ready, you can scan it to go to the Housing Policy Debate website and get a copy of it. And here's my contact info as well if you have any questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Geoff. Okay, next up is Adriana.
Yes. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So, thank you for inviting me. I am Adriana Bruno, and I am the author of the paper Testing the Smart City Paradigm in Italian Mid-Sized Cities, an Empirical Analysis. And my co-author is Professor Federico Fontana, who is Associate Professor in the University of Genova, and I am Research Fellow in the University of Ferrara. I'm very glad to present this paper that is published in the Special Issues in the Housing Policy Debate. I'm very grateful to my reviewer, to the editor, because we received really great comments to improve the paper. So thank you for your time. The purpose of this paper is to make a contribution in theory, because as already you know, the smart city concept does not have a unique definition. However, there are multiple interpretations. So this paper intends to clarify the definition of smart cities as it is applied in the Southern European context, in the south of Italy specifically, and starting from the Giffinger's model. Moreover, we want to make a contribution in research because many scholars have stressed the issues of urban governance in the Southern Europe. Specifically, there is a criticism on mainstream conceptualization of smart cities. So this paper aims to contribute to the development of the smart city as an effective model for urban management, and specifically in its planning in mid-sized cities in Southern Europe. Moreover, we want to make a contribution in practice because this paper offers also critical consideration involved in smart city planning initiative and will offer useful recommendation for future policymakers. As research context and research assumption, the assumption of this paper is that this analysis is that the best strategy for an effective city model is to integrate even the minor smart dimension. This is our research assumption. And as already I have said to you, specified, our research context is the Southern European cities, because urban management is very, very complex, is a very complex process in this context, in this area, because of the reduced level of development and competitiveness, because the excessive indebtedness and the scarcity of infrastructure, such way railways, highway, and so on, and also the high level of unemployment, especially for young people, and their low levels of education. So we have two main research questions in our paper. The first one is, to what extent are smart city policies being implemented in municipalities? And also, what smart city initiatives are being considered in municipalities as part of smart city policy action? As this paper is an empirical analysis, is a primary research. Specifically, the article reports the results of an empirical research related to the definition of the smart city in mid-sized cities in an integrated plans for urban development for Axis 6 of a regional operational program named Campania Region, and the name is Urban Development and Quality of Life. As a methodology, these urban planning documents are explored to see whether and how they contribute to define the implementing of a smart city model, testing the multidimensional model proposed by Geoff in 2007 and then 2010. As you already know, the Geoff model gives the concept of a Geoff contains 6 relevant dimensions of smart city: smart economy, smart people, smart living, smart environment, smart mobility, and smart governance. These are the same dimension that the European Union takes into account in the design of European policies. We have chosen one European policy for our paper. And as you already know, the strategy defined from the European cohesion policy are transformed by region and by nation in operational programs. So we have regional operational programs and national operational programs. At European level, in the planning approach adopted in 2017 and 2013, and also in 2014 and 2020, has introduced the mainstreaming of the urban dimension into the cohesion policy in order to implement an integrated approach able to overcome the sector limit and fragmentation of urban issues. So in the Regional Operational Program, ROP 2007-2013, have adopted of a vertical approach in urban development to the provision of priorities. In the Italian case, we have 10 strategic priorities, and we have the priority number 8 that was called competitiveness, attraction of cities and urban system. The urban development agenda, with the focus on the cities linked to European funds in Campania region, has been defined più Europa, and as a future investment more than 3 billion over funds and over more than 500 intervention. This is the table that you will find in the paper that show you how the Campania, that is the region in Italy, is the most, the budget from the European development is the highest in comparison with the other region. So that's why we have chosen the Campania case, this case, but also there is another region, another motivation that conduct to choose these case studies, also because it's the only initiative that has assigned a programming role to cities and municipalities, introducing and anticipating an innovative and crucial element for the analysis of the research, the bottom-up approach. the Campania region chose the institution of delegation, which transferred many of management and control functions to cities that become intermediaries. So we have 19 middle cities that has a subject with greater autonomy in the management of this program, with a detailed plan of management that the cities specified in a strategic orientation document, and a well-defined financial plan specified in the integrated urban program. So we have these two documents, the strategic orientation document and the integrated urban program document. And these two documents were examined initially using a documentary analysis approach that includes the smart city model of Giffinger. So we did a context textual analysis. These two documents are similar but also are different, because the first one, the strategic document, is more a framework, is a guidelines, and is a program of city development policies. The other one, the integrate urban programs, is a more operational document, and in this document we find a summary of intervention, chrono program, and financial plan. As a primary evidence, you can see that in the first document and in the second documents, there is a high average of presence of smart city dimension, 81% in the first one and 61% in the second one. But you can see also the singular results of the singular dimension. For example, the smart living is the most present in the strategic orientation document, and also smart governance. And the same is a smart living in the integrated urban documents, and also, for example, smart mobility. So this evidence, this data allow us to answer to the first research question: to what extent are smart city policies being implemented in municipalities? So we have captured the smart city dimension in the urban strategic plans, and a large majority of urban strategic plans explicitly consider the smart city model or some of its relevant dimension. Well, the second data that we find in this, the budget of smart city initiative in the urban strategic plans. This is also this table. You will find this table in the paper if you want to read, I mean, carefully with more time. And this data allow us to answer to the second research question: what smart city initiatives are being considered in municipality as part of smart city policy actions? On a global level, in 19 strategic plans, we have to find that they invest a significant amount in the smart city initiative. But about half of these financial resources, over 900 million, are devoted to the field of public building, more than 400 million on smart living, but 23% of the total is dedicated to urban and territorial recovery. Also smart mobility, we found 11%, smart economy 10%, with about 200 million that are devoted to each project about transportation infrastructure. Also smart environment and smart people are close to the ranking, with invest 65 million, and also 3% and 2% of the total mainly dedicated to environment. So you can see how lowest is the percentage of money dedicated to smart environment and smart people. Moreover, there was a preference for programming aimed in the realization of material infrastructure, leaving in the background of the intangible infrastructure, and also of addition and support to the material interventions. Although these investments are quantitative important, however, the intellectual and social capital intervention are really nearly absent in this document. And the most neglected dimension is smart people, is absent in 15 cases. That is like 80% of the total, and also smart environment that is absent in 12 cases. And smart economy is absent in 10 cases. So it confirmed that the strategic weakness of some smart city project and the worst cases is the lack of smart orientation. So the low strategic orientation towards smart people is related to the reduced investment in intangible resources. And this is a limit, and this is a big limitation and a critical point in which public manager should work, because the city can be smart as its people can. So thank you for your attention, and grateful for your question and your suggestion.
Excellent. Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, next up is Shomon.
Great, thanks. Tom, can you hear me and okay and see the slides?
I can hear you fine and your slide is showing up.
Great. So my name is Shomon Shamsuddin, and I'm happy to present this paper, which is co-authored by Sumita Srinivasan. And in this paper, we're looking at just and smart cities. And the idea here, the idea here is to examine what the empirical research has to say about using ICT, or information and communication technology data, to look at housing issues. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the special issue editors and the symposium organizers for putting this together and giving us the opportunity to share our work. So the first thing to note is that in places around the world are experiencing serious housing problems, especially regarding rising rents and house prices relative to income is creating affordability issues. And then of course, affordability problems can lead to reduction in spending on essential needs and lead to forms of residential instability. In addition, the introduction of higher income residents into lower income neighborhoods may also lead to gentrification and displacement. Now, in the face of these problems, information and communication technology, or ICT for short, provides some potential solutions. In fact, as a few of the presenters mentioned, it can reduce transaction costs and search frictions, which may help out with affordability issues. ICT data may actually improve access to information, both the volume of information, but also the detailed or the fine-grained nature of that information, as Geoff pointed out. And ICT may also help predict trends in terms of neighborhood change, including identifying areas that may be going into gentrification and help us to figure out who might be facing displacement pressures. Now, our paper basically looks at these issues and asks, well, what does the empirical research actually tell us? So as previous presenter mentioned, smart cities concept is increasingly popular, and we rely on the sort of basic notion that smart cities use information from digital technology in order to achieve a few goals. One is to improve the delivery of city services. Smart cities may also use technology to enhance and maintain urban infrastructure. And then finally, digital technology may actually work to facilitate and improve communication with urban residents. The general goal from all of these is to create faster and more efficient city operations. And I think the underlying assumption here is that faster, more efficient operations will benefit everyone. Of course, there are a few challenges that should be noted. The increasing use of digital technology raises concerns about surveillance and the increasing threat of censorship, as well as even worse outcomes. There's also an issue that there's the potential for spatial polarization and inequality. Because the uptake for digital technology is not even across people or places, reliance on that technology to make decisions may create inequalities that play out across geography. An alternative view of what cities can be and what cities might look like is the notion of the just city. And the just city operates on several principles. One is that it directly addresses issues around equity. And the just city does this by prioritizing outcomes on a justice basis, as well as providing a lot of value, providing a lot of importance and valuing processes that are inherently inclusionary. So bringing in the voices of various residents, including those who might otherwise be ignored or marginalized. The just city prominently operates by considering the needs of socially disadvantaged groups. And so this can include racial and ethnic minorities, also low-income households and other vulnerable populations. And different from the typical smart city perspective, here the goal is not necessarily to improve efficiency, but it's actually to enhance equity. This just city perspective can also be described as one that's socially inclusive, in which the differences between individuals, both households and groups, are both firmly recognized and clearly well respected. So the literature, as you can see, tends to focus a lot on sort of these theories around what technology might do and alternative views of how the city may operate. But the open question is about what the empirical research has to say. And so that's where our paper comes in. Essentially, we take on this effort to review published empirical research that addresses housing by using information and communication technology, or ICT. So again, these are empirical papers that are using ICT data. And the way that we do this is we look at Web of Science to identify articles that are published in academic journals. And to make this a bit more manageable, we focus on research that's published within the research domain that's called social sciences, as identified in Web of Science. And this includes many fields such as economics and geography, as well as sociology and urban studies. We use a number of search terms, some of which are listed there. So things like big data and cell phone, internet, online searching, as well as housing, homeless, and a bunch of other ones. And we use various truncations of these terms in order to get a first set of papers. And that first pass through yielded over 500 responses. However, many of these were duplicates, and quite a few were focused on theory or were either descriptive pieces or sort of what we might call speculative approaches. So we excluded those and any other papers that did not focus, that did not include empirical research that was focused on addressing housing issues using ICT data. We also excluded papers that relied primarily on government administrative data, again, in order to focus our work on ICT research. And I should also mention that unpublished conference papers and proceedings were also excluded from the analysis. After that, we got a final set of papers from there, and then we used citation chaining, both backward and forward reference searching, where we looked at the papers that were cited in the papers that came up in our search. And we also looked for papers that cite the papers that came up in our search in order to expand our pool and make sure that basically we weren't missing anything important. So based on our assessment of those about 40 plus papers, we found sort of two themes that prominently emerged from the empirical literature on housing and ICT data. The first is that housing search and price was sort of a prominent focus for these papers. And the other main theme was about home sharing. And so I'll go into each of these briefly. On housing search and prices, there's kind of two subcategories that emerge. The first is using information and communication technology data to predict housing market trends. Most of this research relies on search engine data from Google, and some prominent work uses it to basically find proxies and improve the accuracy of estimates of US housing market sales and prices. And then some additional work finds evidence on the transfer of house price information from larger cities to smaller cities in China. The second main area under housing search and prices is research that uses ICT data to test hedonic models. Primarily, we see this in examining the role of amenities, especially neighborhood amenities, in their relationship with house prices. And there's a few studies on Shanghai and quite a bit of work looking at amenities and house prices in Singapore, Beijing, and other cities. And here the amenities are things like park space, proximity to transportation hubs, and those kinds of things. We find relatively little work in the housing search and prices theme that looks at lower income groups. There's just a couple of studies that look at informal housing, including the submarkets of informal housing in Shanghai. And then one study that looks at using open street data to figure out the locations of healthcare facilities and water facilities in informal settlements in Nairobi. And then some earlier work that looks at inexpensive housing in the United States, which finds that a small fraction of below market rent housing is found on online listings relative to what we see in other data. The other theme that I mentioned was home sharing, and there's quite a lot of research, empirical research on this topic. And again, this can be divided into a couple different subcategories. So one is the effects on housing supply. A primary concern with home sharing is that because landlords have more information and may have home sharing platforms have made it easier for them to connect with potential clients, that they might find out that it's actually much more profitable to rent housing on a short-term basis as opposed to a long-term basis. And there are several studies that find that home sharing or an increasing number of units on home sharing is associated with fewer units available for long-term rent. And there's evidence of this in several cities around the world, including Hong Kong, London, New York, and Paris, as well as in Sydney and others. Similarly, these home sharing listings are often found in gentrified areas. So places that actually have already experienced gentrification as opposed to ones that may be soon to gentrify. And there's evidence here in both New York and Toronto. One thing to note from these studies on home sharing is that a methodological decision is that the researchers often assume that frequent listings of a unit on these home sharing sites actually means that the unit is unavailable for long-term occupancy. This is a decision that they have to make in order to use the data, but this may not necessarily hold. Another sub-theme on the home sharing research looks at the effects on rents and prices. And an increase in the number of listings is positively associated with increasing rents in Boston, also with higher rents and home prices in zip codes all over the United States, as well as higher rents in France. Now, most of these associations are relatively small. So we're talking about a 1 standard deviation increase in listings associated with a 0.5% increase in rents, for example. But it's important to note that these small magnitudes are measured over relatively large geographic areas. This leaves open the possibility that we're seeing higher associations with rent, or excuse me, higher rent increases at a neighborhood level or even at a smaller geography.
1 minute, Shomon.
Thanks, Tom. And also note that it's a possible lagging indicator of gentrification. One other point is that there's just a couple of studies that this is also growing, looking at discrimination. And there's evidence that home sharing is associated with rejecting applicants or charging different prices based on race or ethnicity or other identities. So one of the takeaways from some of this empirical research is that it's a little bit about like the drunk who's searching for the keys under the lamp because the light's there, even though the keys are lost maybe a couple blocks away. And you can see in this modern version, you know, the person also has a cell phone to use that light as well. We find that racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented in ICT data, as well as available housing units. And so research that focuses on these may reproduce and reinforce existing social and spatial inequalities. And of course, even for those groups that are represented, the ICT data may present skewed pictures of their preferences because of past experiences of discrimination and search behavior. ICT data are certainly no substitute for information on the ground. And we see some good examples of how to use knowledge of informal housing to complement our understanding of what ICT can provide. And there's a potential to channel ICT data to address disadvantaged households. I'll just close by noting that ICT data as applied to housing can facilitate unequal spatial development, but it might be used in other ways to advance the tenets of the just city. A conventional view would think of ICT data as arguing for more efficient ends, but we suggest that researchers try to leverage ICT data to address more equitable ends as far as housing is concerned.
Okay, terrific. 4 excellent presentations on four really excellent papers that will be appearing in the special section. I want to encourage the presenters, take a look at the Q&A and see if there's questions that you can go ahead and answer there. I think there's 2 or 3 in there, and then whatever we have remaining or any new questions that come up, we can answer in the end. Right now, I wanted to move to the 3 commentaries, and these will be 10 minutes each, and we'll start with Rob Goodspeed.
All right, hello everybody. Just to start, thanks Tom for leading this issue, and Mato and Mackenzie for putting the event together. Nice to see everyone on the line. And I've opted not to have slides. My commentary is barely 3 pages long, 4 if you include the citations, so it's just a short. I figure if I can't verbally summarize it, then I don't remember it. And really the question I was thinking about was, how should the kind of engaged scholarly community of community development, I think that we're all in different ways engaged with smart cities. And I point out that, as we've seen today very well in Ariel's talk, and you might know from your your own experience, a lot of smart city initiatives are focused on efficiency and really a cybernetic logic of technology-driven initiatives out of City Hall. And my point there was no degree of engagement is going to transform them, you know, if their starting point is someplace different than where we are. Another set of papers I've seen have to do with critiquing smart cities, often from a kind of epistemological point of view. And I think as much as this is needed, it doesn't speak to the applied dimension practitioners, like what do we do? Okay, we're not happy with City Hall spending money on smart garbage cans. We know their data are flawed or missing community insights. What is our own agenda, or what should our own agenda be? And in the comment, I argue that it should be about, you know, kind of keep a traditional idea going about knowledge infrastructures. And many of you are familiar with the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, or NNIP, and a lot of their work has been collating, collecting data, making it available to community development practitioners. And in the article, I propose several areas I think smart city community development types could take on. They include real-time eviction data, improved data about energy utilities seems appropriate. We have rolling brownouts or blackouts in Texas, and real-time and more spatially detailed data about health outcomes. So I think having written this over a year ago, I think the history has really justified those, and there's actually been progress in those areas. Maybe you're involved in it. And so to conclude, my kind of a rallying call for all of us as we go forward and bump into these folks putting up smart infrastructure. And I say, amid the competing definitions for the new smart development paradigm of the smart city, let us put forth our own paradigm every bit as ambitious as those promoted by other fields. Let us dream of a world where unprecedented insights into cities are at our fingertips, and are at the fingertips of those who work to improve them, whether they be citizens, community groups, professionals, or public officials. So in reviewing the chapters here, I think my comments very consistent in some ways with some of the other arguments here, including Nick Marantz's more detailed discussion of housing data. And it's been fun to hear the connections here and read through the papers. Thanks for joining us, and do take a look. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And I also put links to all of the papers and all of the comments in the chat, and you can access them there. Depending on how you're accessing them, if you can't get them for free, let me know, and I can assist with that. So I've got my email address there as well. So just let me know. Great. Now we'll move on to Nick's comments.
All right, can you see my screen, my slideshow? Great. All right, so as Rob said, I'm Nick Marantz. I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine. Rob didn't say that part, but what Rob did say is that I'm talking about how to make cities smarter about land use regulation, and by so doing, promote housing affordability. So as just sort of an overview, one of the most important urban governance functions is the regulation of land use. That is dictating, specifying what is allowed on a particular piece of land. And in the United States, that is primarily, that function is primarily carried out by local governments, such as cities. And it's particularly important when it comes to housing, because what is allowed to be built can affect the affordability of housing. So it can affect the affordability of market rate housing, because holding all else equal, apartments are cheaper than single family homes. And it can certainly affect the availability of below market rate or subsidized housing, because as a result of economies of scale, it's generally necessary to build below market rate housing as multifamily housing. So, what we know about how local governments regulate land use and what local governments themselves know about how they regulate land use has improved a lot. We know a lot more today than we did even 10 years ago, but we still don't know that much. And many cities don't really know that much about how land use is regulated and about the affordability of housing within their jurisdiction. And this lack of data poses considerable hurdles for governments seeking to address problems of housing affordability, and for a variety of stakeholders seeking to craft more effective policy and seeking to advocate for more effective policy. So I want to discuss some of the principal obstacles to getting better data about land use regulation and its relationship to housing. I want to describe some promising efforts to surmount these obstacles. And I want to end by explaining how the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development could pursue its mandate to affirmatively further fair housing by supporting improved data collection. So why is it so difficult to collect relevant data? Well, one clear obstacle consists of resource constraints. That is, many municipalities have constrained budgets. Say virtually all municipalities have constrained budgets. And quite a few have few, if any, full-time planners on staff. And so as a result, they may have limited capacity to manage data related to land use regulation and to housing permitting. A second constraint is political. That is, land use regulation affects resources like owner-occupied housing that are extremely salient to local voters. They matter a lot to local voters. And local planners and elected officials, as a result, may be reluctant to disclose data that could damage their reputations or harm their relationships with local constituents. A third challenge is conceptual, which is it's often not clear which standardized measures most accurately capture local constraints on housing development, and I should also say local efforts to preserve housing affordability or to promote housing affordability. And just as an example, cities may be able to relax their zoning, but actually make it no easier to build by imposing more stringent parking requirements, or by requiring multiple hearings for any new proposed project, right? So different regulations may be interchangeable, and as a result, looking at any one regulation may not actually be particularly informative. So those are three obstacles. On top of those three obstacles, there's a third set of challenges, which are technical. So the relevant data are multi-scalar. That is, there are state-level policies at play. There are municipality-wide policies at play. There are parcel-level policies at play. And the data are also longitudinal. That is, all of these policies, and for the moment, I'm just talking about policies, all of these policies can change over time and can change at different times, and new policies can be added at different times. And they're idiosyncratic for the most part. That is, there's no standardized format for zoning ordinances. There's no standardized format for impact fee schedules. That is, the fees that developers have to pay when they build new housing. And frequently, relevant information is located in parts of laws that you wouldn't expect. For example, basically every new project, whether or not it complies with the underlying zoning, is subject to legislative consideration in the city of San Francisco, but you won't find that in the San Francisco zoning ordinance. It's in the city charter. And in addition, the units of analysis that we're interested in are unstable. So probably the most stable of these units are municipalities, but even municipal boundaries can change from time to time. Parcels are frequently split or consolidated, and units within buildings can be reconfigured. And those are just three examples of the kinds of instability of the units of analysis. So there are some big challenges, and I don't want to pretend that all of them can be easily surmounted, but I do want to point to three, what I think are very promising trends, and that can certainly be built upon in the coming years to improve the quality of data that we have related to land use regulation and its relationship to housing affordability. So first of all, although zoning isn't everything, zoning is hugely important. That is basically what can be built on a parcel, what is permitted to be built on a parcel. And so zoning ordinances typically include a map dividing a jurisdiction into districts and text indicating the uses permitted in each of those districts. And as I said before, zoning can be a principal constraint on below market rate housing and relatively affordable market rate housing. And so understanding variation within municipalities and across municipalities is very important. But as I also said before, zoning ordinances are extremely idiosyncratic. And so the same district can mean one thing in jurisdiction A and a different thing in jurisdiction B. And so it's important to be able to standardize zoning ordinances. And there are a few ways that this has been done. I think the most rigorous way to do it is through a careful review of local zoning ordinances and consultation with local planners. And that's the approach that Massachusetts took almost 2 decades ago for a standardized zoning data set. More recently, the Southern California Association of Governments has undertaken a similar task. The Othering and Belonging Institute has also undertaken a zoning standardization project for single-family zoning alone. Other metropolitan planning organizations are also undertaking this. And then there are also several efforts to use alternative data sources or natural language processing algorithms to estimate zoning stringency at the regional or the national scale.
About 1 minute, Nick.
Okay, I'll speed it up. I'm almost done. So a second opportunity, I think, is better parcel and project level regulatory information. This is about discretionary entitlements, that is things that are subject to review by a planning commission or by a city council, environmental reviews and development fees. Local governments have very limited data about this. There's a lot that could be done to improve the quality of data the local governments collect. State governments are in a position to provide the mandates for data collection. The federal government is in a position to provide the resources for local governments to collect these data. And the third is data concerning below market rate units. These include rent control restrictions, but also even basic attributes like the number of below market rate units, the unit sizes of these units, age restrictions. Much of this data is very poorly maintained at the local level, if it's maintained at all. There have been a couple of important efforts to improve the quality of the data. In particular, the National Housing Preservation Database is, I think, a major innovation here. And so I'll wrap up just by saying that the Federal Fair Housing Act requires federal agencies to administer housing and urban development programs in a manner to affirmatively further fair housing. HUD could help fulfill its obligation in this regard by providing grants and incentives for state and local governments to consolidate disparate data sources, standardize the consolidated sources, disseminate these data, and archive the data so that researchers and policymakers can identify changes over time. I want to wrap up by saying better data will not, standing alone, solve the problems of housing affordability, but any city that wishes to be smart must be well informed about the effects of its laws.
And terrific. Thank you, Nick. And then our final comment is from Tim.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear and see my slides? All
Yes,
good? Okay, that's great. Okay, first of all, thanks very much for Tom for your kind invitation to to contribute to this magnificent special issue with a commentary piece. And my comment mainly focused on a high-level perspective on smart city, arguing that we need to go beyond this classical efficiency talk around the infrastructure and technology for establishing more sustainable urban futures. I don't have a co-author, but the ideas that I shared in this paper and in this presentation is a part of an ongoing research collaboration with the research group I established a few years ago in my university, Queensland University and Technology Smart City Research Group, along with the network the group established between Australia and Brazil on smart city research and practice, along with my research lab that houses at the moment 10 very intelligent PhD students. Okay, legendary Chinese ancient curse states living in interesting times. I think we are that curse have become the reality, and we are living in extremely interesting times. And world population is nearing to 8 billion within the carrying capacity of our planet. It's not possible to provide quality of life to these 8 billion people. And this is also impacting on the food, water, and energy insecurities. Biodiversity loss is making those securities even higher. Technology at one hand looks like a panacea to some of the urbanization or global problems we have, but at the same time, it's creating so many inequalities, which previous speakers talk about, creating disruption and surveillance risks. We have information and data, but we don't know, how to trust this data. Misinformation, fake news, and they are also being used for radicalization of some population. Economy is not going anywhere, better. Rootless neo-capitalism, for example, is boosting the socioeconomic inequalities. World has been always in conflict. I think this is the human nature, but I think we are having a new type of conflict, climate conflict and climate refugees, a major problem that we have no idea how to deal with it. And lastly, governance, it's supposed to be the enabler to solve these issues, address these problems, but again, political short-termism, corporate influence is not allowing our cities or nations to address these issues adequately. So this is the bit dark picture of as an opening pitch, unfortunately. And in the last 2 decades or so, we have the new concept of smart city. In general definition, as we all know, that it emphasized this digital data and technologies to improve the efficiencies for that will help economic development, improve quality of life, and improving the sustainability of the city. While this is well and good, and also we are seeing really awesome technology that is actually supporting not only the businesses but also societies as well. We have autonomous shuttle buses everywhere. In Singapore, robot dogs are maintaining social distances. In our hospitals, we are starting to see this social robots. Dubai's Robocop, chatbots of the businesses, airport security, environmental research is heavily using machine learning, drones, so on and so forth. Our homes are getting smarter. This is all well and good. But at the same time, myself and many scholars are thinking that this is a very narrow focus on what a truly smart and sustainable city could be. Therefore, in recent years, I have developed, if you like, a conceptual view on what smart city can be or should be. So it follows the input, process, output, and impact model. So we have as an input the cities or localities, towns, assets, indigenous assets, and these are processed over the important trio of technology, policy, and community as the key drivers to coming up with policies and strategies and actions to create the outputs or outcomes, if you like, in economic, society, environment, and governance areas, the desired one, ideally. And this will eventually, if delivered and developed and practiced within the knowledge-based and sustainable urban development practices, hopefully will lead to formation of truly smart and sustainable cities. Within this perspective, the definition, the revised definition of what's smart and sustainable city would be just going beyond the efficiencies, developing a locality as a robust systems of systems, along with the sustainable practices, supported with technology, community, and policy. We all want to generate desired outcomes, but also the important question is, who are we going to develop these desired outcomes for? I think it should be all humans, but not limited to all humans, also non-humans as well, flora, fauna, or the planet in general. So these are the ideas I discussed in the paper, but in a couple of slides, I would like to take it to maybe a step further. So what I'm seeing that this smart city hype will, burst or end slowly, maybe sharply down the track. So something has to be replaced, this notion. And who mentioned about, I think Shomon mentioned about the just city, something along the lines of just city, maybe a responsible city or responsible cities I would mention. So some areas that we need to consolidate, for example, our cities or the urban policy making requires, broader stakeholder engagement to agree and build on the city based on the common feature that with consensus. That doesn't exist apart from some very minor cases here and there. And we need to build the trust, not only the trust in the technology, but trust in the public trust in the process of making plans and implementing them. Agility is critical to actually to respond disruptions and continuously changing conditions. Don't forget, we are living in interesting times. So agility is a critical skill. And monopoly, there are so many ways, tech providers or infrastructure providers, major international construction companies, they are monopolistic in ways. So we need to go somehow beyond this. Ethics is probably one of the most critical areas that we need to focus more, how we can have a responsible development, responsible urban innovation. These are critical, and how we can actually establish common goods, common principles around them is an area of interest and also need. So this needs to be linked with some regulations for not only urban planning, but our cities are becoming more technologically wired, that how technology adoption and disruption needs to be mitigated and managed for those who are heavily disadvantaged from this. And this brings to the last point of social good. Social good for all, social good not only for human, for non-humans as well. And the latest area that I'm working on, I have over the years developed this itch for how we can make urban governance, urban planning processes more responsible. So one way of linking this with the smart city discourse is looking at the responsible urban innovation. This is the latest some conceptualization I developed with my colleagues, that we are actually again putting technology, policy, and community at the heart with an example of artificial intelligence systems of local governments. Again, we believe that the local governments are the key driver and regulator of cities. So we are started to look at how ethical, explainable, transport, and frugal these artificial intelligence systems that local governments are adopting these days. And we are also looking at what cost, benefit, risk, and impacts these technologies or systems and platforms have been addressed in the policy, and how they impact on the community, and what community inputs can be put into these systems development, deployment, and management. So how we are going to convince communities that these technologies that even the developers have not so much idea of what they are going to turn into. So this is an area of approaching the area. So I would like to, by minding the time, conclude
About 1 minute, Tim.
With the last slide. So adoption of this technology policy community trio is, I believe, that is important, and it could be a good approach to tackle some of the major issues, for example, sustainable, and the other one is how to responsibly develop our cities or maintain the well-being of our cities. So this is critical. And thank you very much.
Great, excellent. I very much enjoyed the 4 papers and three comments. Kind of really covered the broad range of issues and topics that connect to smart cities, whatever those happen to be, and just a fantastic conversation. We've got some time for question and answer. I think we've got 5 open questions in the Q&A window, and so maybe we can jump in there. Looks like at the top, question from Lori Goldman for Ariel.
Yeah, so I actually answered a question from Lori with an I don't know, but maybe I could read the original question, and maybe there are other folks that Lori could connect with kind of who are in the audience, given the expertise of everyone here. But Lori was asking me if I knew anything about value capture mechanisms like linkage fees for private sector developers who are doing new development in supporting the laying of digital infrastructure. And so we had in the answered column of the Q&A, we had a little bit of a back and forth about to what extent the move to smart cities also requires us to maybe take a look at how we collectively are regulating the internet, and that it is not regulated as a utility or the ways that other public infrastructures are. So it sort of leaves it outside of the purview of environmental mitigation or adequate public facilities ordinances or impact fees. But as we think about equity and sort of where we're moving, and I think, again, this pandemic moment makes this particularly clear when we think about the infrastructure needed for many people to continue to work or to continue to school, for young people. You know, do we need to reconsider that so that internet or certain kinds of smart infrastructures are considered in the same vein as transportation or traffic mitigation or open space in the context of development? So that was sort of the reflection I had. I don't actually know specifically about that because our study didn't look at new development, but it sounds like Lori is looking for folks who are doing research on that. So if there are folks, you know, obviously in the audience, we have lots of collective expertise. It does seem like a ripe area, particularly for the community development field and what that would mean for nonprofit and for-profit housing developers.
Great, and also for the audience, some of the other questions that were asked and answered are also appear in that window, so you can check that out. Let's see, the next question from Gary. with regards to the building codes consolidating with fast and upgrading optimized technology, are there any possibilities of any building code amendments while these acquisition faces possible challenges such as microclimate issues and relevance to urban heat island effects and heat wave impacts? I'm not sure exactly who that is directed towards, but any of the panelists want to jump in on that? Okay, well, let's move to the next one then. Has anyone examined street maintenance versus property value or racial makeup of owners and renters? Is it easy to determine street condition through remote sensing, but actually using it to prioritize repairs may be driven by factors other than condition? Do potholes in the mayor's streets get fixed first? Thanks, that's from John. Any thoughts on that?
So can I mean, I don't have a direct answer to that question, but I appreciate the issue that's raised around sort of the political, I guess, small p way that cities manage their public infrastructure. And I would say from our study in West Baltimore, although we didn't look at those things specifically, the question is resonant with what we found around people's mistrust of government and of many city agencies. So it's not even clear to me in our research from our research, if people would necessarily even use reporting infrastructure to city agencies, or to what extent that would be activated, because there is such a history of mistrust, for just the example that the audience member weighed in on, right? That there's a history of not serving these neighborhoods and serving more affluent folks. And that history actually in Baltimore is repeating itself through the investment of smart city infrastructure, right? That they see the interventions going in to whiter and more affluent neighborhoods first, and folks in the West Baltimore community that we were working in, they saw that and they remember it. So I think that's important to note, right? And when we think about what these interventions are, we need to, again, as per our study, we need to think about the process of engagement and the process of implementation. And it's not as easy as saying like, well, we now have a reporting mechanism for potholes as per the comment. That there's a whole apparatus that sort of lives behind that intervention and that solution. So.
Okay, it looks like a couple questions for Nick. I don't know if you've seen there about, let's see, reference to a Northern Virginia county. Maybe that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, I read that as more of a comment
than
a question. I can respond. I was in the process of typing a response to Matthew, but I can just take.
Okay,
take that.
why don't you go ahead with that?
Yeah. So the question is, have I seen thoughts on advocate-driven attempts to build these data sets, like desegregate Connecticut zoning atlas of Connecticut? Should cities use these tools in the meantime when they lack the resources to build their own? The answer is yes, absolutely. Desegregate Connecticut is a fantastic project. It's sort of an academic advocate collaboration. I'm also involved in a more academic driven effort to collect some of the relevant data for California. I think all of these efforts are really potentially important. At the same time, I don't want them to. I don't want to suggest that I think they can substitute for effective regulatory intervention. I think federal subsidies for local governments and state governments to actually collect the data are going to be really important, and state requirements for local governments to actually conduct the data collection will also be vital. I'm skeptical that these efforts are sustainable, and also, you know, if you have a lot of advocacy groups doing their own data collection, you have all of these disparate data sources that may not be commensurable, and so the data are less useful than they might otherwise be, but it's a vital first step. And I'm a huge fan of desegregating Connecticut.
And then I think the last one in the Q&A window here, I think that might be more of a comment as well, referencing growth management and the need for public education. Okay, did any kind of final comments from the panelists just in wrapping up?
And I thank you, Tom, very much for this opportunity. And I'm hoping next year you'll do a version of this as well. I think that could be something, bring this, not solely the advocacy of how good the technology is for cities, but just providing some critics on how we need to see our cities and housing issues within this context as well. And I think there's so much contributions are as urban scholars we need to do in this field, because it seems to be things are not going to a good direction, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there was one last question in the Q&A. Any concerns about AI?
Yes, definitely. The issue is around AI is we don't know what it is, even the developers. It's a black box. That's why there's a new stream of AI researchers developing explainable AI. So it is XAI. So this is really critical, because the current and the last couple of decades, the examples of how we try to incorporate AI system in the society, which actually didn't work, because AI is based on big data and training principles, and it's like having a child. If you cater, first, given that all the genetics is right, and the second that there's a environment that actually providing good manners, good principles, morality, and good education systems, and then this child will be providing and contributing to the well-being of the society. But in the case it is not, it's the same thing. AI is a child, and we need to know first the basic principles of how to regulate, how to develop ethics, and how to create it and nurture it for the social good for all. So I think that's the challenge, is as hard as bringing up kids to this life, and bringing up AIs is even probably twice harder.
I think I saw Ariel and Nick also nodding their heads. If you care to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ken touched on a lot of it. I mean, we know, and again, a lot of this research comes out of work in information science, but we know that the bias is built into things like facial recognition, right? They're discriminatory. And I'll just say again, from our experience and what we learned from the communities of West Baltimore, our most marginalized communities are aware of the ways in which advances in technology and innovations in policy and interventions have been used as an instrument to further marginalize them. And in communities that are over-policed in particular, this is a concern about surveillance and about, furthering furthering and exacerbating their marginalization to job opportunities, right? And I think that one of the worrying things is that there seems to be a lot of traction in AI in the public safety world, right? So you see it in policing, you see it in the judicial system around, sort of sentencing, and that's essentially we're ground testing these technologies in our most vulnerable communities. So it's actually sort of the opposite of where I would imagine you would want these seen. And when you see the data of how harmful they are, I don't think people wouldn't sort of readily agree to sort of be participants in a lot of this if they see sort of the back end outcomes. And again, from our research grounded in the communities of West Baltimore, they are acutely aware of these dangers and are really anxious and uninterested in coercive participation if this is what smart cities means in their cities.
Nick or Geoff, did you have comments?
I don't have much to add except that sort of looping back to Geoff's presentation and an exchange, I think, between Geoff and Ariel in the chat. I think as Ariel was suggesting, the potential for algorithmic bias is pretty substantial and difficult to detect. And so I think in the context of, for example, Fair Housing Act claims related to the digital advertising of housing opportunities, the Fair Housing Act has been relatively poorly enforced for basically the entirety of its existence. In part, that relates to the challenges of enforcement, certainly not entirely, but those challenges become much greater, I think, when you're dealing with problems of algorithmic bias, especially when the algorithms are not only proprietary, but based on AI in a way that as Tan suggested, may make it so that even the proprietors of those algorithms don't actually know what they're doing.
I had one general comment to build on that too, and that there are certain aspects of this that are unique to AI and the smart cities paradigm, but I think in a lot of ways this just intensifies what is a more general problem with prediction that we do as a species. Where the way that we predict is that we forecast the future based on the past. And so if we have past data that arose through racist practices and were shaped by those practices, we fit our models to that past experience, and that tells us what to expect or how to behave in the future and what to do. Until we can break that feedback loop, we end up just perpetuating the exact same cycles over and over again.
Adriana or Shomon, did you want to add anything? Okay. Well, thank you again to all of our presenters, and thank you for the participants that asked questions and all of the attendees. I think this always kind of brings a little more life to some what is otherwise just on paper in the journal. So I always enjoy this and discussion that comes out of this, and hopefully some follow-on discussion and network building that can come out of it as well. So thank you all very much for spending a couple hours with us. Really appreciate it. I hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.